On the morning of the custody hearing, an old man with a prison limp followed his daughter into the courtroom, holding his grandson's tiny hand. The judge glanced up, saw the man's face, and went rigid, as if he'd just seen a ghost he'd buried 15 years ago. This was the foreman he'd once condemned as a killer, the verdict that made his career. Now that same ruined man was back, asking the court to save the only family he had left. Before we dive in, tell us in comments where in the world you are watching from. On the third floor of the downtown courthouse, the air felt heavier than it should on an ordinary Tuesday. Every seat was filled, a restless crowd pressed shoulder to shoulder as Judge Elliot Mason flipped through the custody file in front of him. He had seen hundreds of cases like this, or so he told himself. One more broken home, one more child in the middle. Then the courtroom doors creaked open. An older man stepped in, moving slowly, his weight shifted onto a worn metal cane. At his side walked his daughter, Lena, fingers clenched around a crumpled tissue, and close to his other hand shuffled a small boy who kept his eyes on the floor. They had taken only a few steps toward the plaintiff's table when Mason's hand froze above the gavel. His gaze lifted, met the older man's face, and the color drained from his own. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to tilt. His lips parted, and the words slipped out in a hoarse whisper that carried farther than he intended. "Why are you here?" The murmurs died at once. Pens hovered over legal pads, even the bailiff stilled. The man, Daniel Ruiz, didn't answer. He simply held the judge's stare with a tired, unblinking calm. Anyone watching felt it in their chest. This was no ordinary custody hearing. 15 years earlier, long before courtrooms made his hands shake, Daniel Ruiz's world had been made of steel and concrete instead of paperwork and fear. He was the foreman everyone requested on the big downtown projects, the man who walked the scaffolding at dawn checking bolts with his own hands because he didn't trust shortcuts. That morning, the sky had been bright and hard, cranes cutting clean lines against the blue as workers shouted to one another over the clang of metal. Daniel was halfway through his rounds when the sound hit, an ugly creak, a shudder that didn't belong to any machine. For a split second, the entire frame of the building seemed to hold its breath. Then the floor above buckled. Steel screamed. A section of the structure tore loose and crashed down, swallowing dust, tools, and human voices in a roar that shook the street. Sirens came next. Reporters followed, turning the street into a wall of cameras and microphones. By afternoon, the developers' lawyers were already spinning the story. A negligent foreman, ignored warnings, a tragic but convenient human error. Daniel knew better. He'd seen the invoices, heard the quiet orders to accept cheaper materials, watched safety reports get rewritten. But the company had money, insurance, and friends in the right places. He had calloused hands and a thin savings account. Weeks later, in a smaller courtroom under harsh fluorescent lights, a young, sharp Judge Elliot Mason listened as expensive attorneys painted Daniel as the man who had killed a worker through negligence. Daniel tried to explain, voice rough from sleepless nights, that he had followed every protocol he could with what he was given. His court-appointed lawyer shuffled papers and avoided eye contact. The developer's expert spoke with polished calm. The dead man's family sat rigid, staring at Daniel as if he were the one who had pushed their son into the collapse. Mason's jaw was tight as he read the verdict, words practiced, decisive. He talked about sending a message, about accountability, about how lives were worth more than shortcuts. He never mentioned falsified reports or missing invoices. Those details never officially existed. When the sentence came, years in prison, fines he would never be able to pay, Daniel barely heard the gasp behind him. Teenage Lena was in the back row, school backpack still slung over one shoulder, tears running down her face as deputies closed cuffs around her father's wrists. In that moment, a label settled on his shoulders like a brand burned into steel, the foreman who killed a man. It would follow his name into every job interview, every neighborhood whisper, every nervous glance at his daughter for years to come. When Daniel finally walked out of prison, the city he returned to did not feel like the one he had left. His hair was thinner, his shoulders stooped, and the injury he'd taken during the collapse had settled into a permanent limp that turned every staircase into a small battle. But the limp wasn't what people noticed first. It was the name. In every warehouse manager's eyes, at every half-polite interview, he could see it, recognition, a flicker of doubt, the quiet calculation of risk. So he stopped trying to explain. Instead, he took whatever work didn't require a background check or a reference, unloading trucks in the cold hours before dawn, mopping off his floors when everyone else had gone home, scrubbing away other people's footprints because he no longer knew how to leave his own. At home, the silence between him and Lena grew thick. She had waited for him, finished high school while her father's trial played on local news, and learned to walk past neighbors who lowered their voices and said the word killer like they were spitting something bitter. Part of her hated the way the verdict had swallowed their lives, another part remembered the man who had worked double shifts so she could have new shoes at the start of every school year. That conflict sat between them at dinner, in the way she avoided his eyes, in the way he changed the subject whenever the past came near. Lena tried to outrun it. She enrolled in nursing school, studied late, and moved into a small apartment that smelled of new paint and freedom. When she met Ryan Calder, a paramedic with quick hands and a quicker smile, it felt like proof that life could finally give her something uncomplicated. Daniel shook the man's hand, nodded at his uniform, and told himself to be glad. You've probably seen that look a parent gives when they want to trust but don't quite know how. He kept his distance, afraid his reputation would cling to Lena like dust and stain anything good she found. At first, Ryan was everything people said he was, funny, helpful, always ready with a joke to lighten her long shifts. But little things began to show. A sharp comment about a male co-worker. A question that sounded like a check, who were you with? An apology wrapped in a compliment after his voice rose too high. When Lena found out she was pregnant, she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the test in her hand, and told herself this would fix things. People changed when they became parents, didn't they? They grew up, calmed down, remembered what mattered. She clung to that hope like a lifeline. Daniel noticed the change in a different way. He saw the long sleeves in the middle of summer, the flinch when someone knocked too hard on the door, the arguments that bled through apartment walls when he visited with a bag of groceries. When he caught a glimpse of a bruise on her wrist and Lena laughed it off, "I'm clumsy, Dad, you know me," his heart folded in on itself. Quietly, without pushing, he told her she and the baby could move in with him. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, but the offer brushed against something raw inside her. She shook her head, eyes hard. "Courts never helped us. Police never helped us. They just ruined you. I'm not dragging them into my life again." That old case had taught Lena a cruel lesson, that stepping into a courtroom didn't mean protection, it meant losing control. So she stayed where she was, telling herself she could manage, that things would get better, while Daniel lay awake at night imagining every shout he hadn't heard and every bruise she refused to name. It didn't happen in some dramatic thunderstorm or during a holiday, it happened on an ordinary Tuesday night when everyone was too tired to pretend anymore. Lena had just finished a double shift. The sink was full of dishes, laundry piled on a chair, and Mateo sat on the floor rolling a toy car back and forth, humming to himself. Ryan came in late, smelling of sweat and cheap beer, his jaw already tight. The argument started small, about money, missed calls, who was supposed to pick up Mateo from daycare, but years of resentment sat just behind every word. Lena tried to keep her voice level, not wanting to wake their son, but Ryan's temper flared fast. He scoffed at her budget, accused her of always making him the bad guy, and when she reminded him she was covering most of the bills lately, something in his face snapped. He grabbed a glass off the counter and hurled it against the wall. The shatter cut through the room like a gunshot. Mateo dropped his toy and scrambled behind the couch, hands over his ears, eyes wide with a fear no child should know. Lena moved to shield him, and Ryan stepped in front of her, fingers digging into her arms so hard she could feel the bruise blooming under his touch. "Don't you walk away from me," he hissed, then, as quickly as it came, the rage broke into curses and the slam of the front door as he stormed out into the night. For a long moment, all Lena could hear was the ticking of the kitchen clock and her own pulse thudding in her ears. Mateo sobbed into her side, whispering, "Mama, don't let him come back," and something inside her finally gave way. Within an hour, she was driving through quiet streets, one hand on the wheel, the other wrapped around her throbbing arm, while Mateo dozed fitfully in the back seat clutching a stuffed dinosaur. When Daniel opened his small house door in his work polo, smelling faintly of cleaning chemicals, he didn't need an explanation. The sight of his daughter's swollen arm and his grandson's hollow eyes told him everything. Anger surged up in him, old and hot, the kind that made his fists clench and his mind race straight to Ryan's front door. But when he reached for his jacket, Lena grabbed his sleeve, shaking her head hard. "Please, Dad. If you go over there, it'll only get worse," she whispered, voice raw. So instead of marching into another disaster, Daniel reached for the phone. He scrolled through a faded list of numbers until he found one he hadn't dialed in years, a former co-worker who now worked at a city legal aid office. The conversation was quiet but firm. There were new laws now, they said, protections his family hadn't had back then, emergency protective orders, specialized domestic violence units, pro bono attorneys trained to handle men like Ryan. Lena sat at the table, listening with her arms crossed over her chest as if holding herself together. Every mention of court made her flinch. Images of her father in handcuffs, the judge's gavel coming down, the word guilty echoing in her ears, those memories still lived close to the surface. When Daniel hung up, he studied her face for a long moment. "Things aren't like they were when I stood in front of that bench," he said quietly. "They can't erase what happened to me. But they might be able to protect you and Mateo." For the first time in years, the word court left his mouth without bitterness. Somewhere between his shame and his fear, a decision had formed. He would not stand in the shadows and watch the system swallow his daughter like it did him. If they were going back into that building, they would go armed with truth, with help, and with him at her side. By the time the custody hearing finally resumed, the courtroom felt smaller, as if the walls themselves were listening. Judge Elliot Mason sat a little straighter than usual, the file in front of him heavier than its slim thickness suggested. On the cover, two names stared back at him, Daniel Ruiz versus Ryan Calder. Below them, in smaller type, was a note that made his stomach knot: maternal grandfather, Daniel Ruiz. He had seen that name before. He had signed it into history. In the years since the building collapse, Mason had done what many powerful men do with their regrets. He buried them under work, under praise, under the reassuring words of colleagues who said he had only followed the evidence. But he had still read the oversight report when it finally went public. He had seen the buried memos, the falsified safety inspections, the quiet settlement that never mentioned Daniel's name. And he had lain awake some nights knowing that his message of accountability had landed on the wrong man. Now, as Daniel lowered himself into the chair beside Lena, that old weight pressed down on his chest. The limp, the set of his jaw, even the way he placed both hands on the table before sitting, Mason recognized it all with a chill that ran deeper than the air conditioning. On the other side, Ryan swaggered in with a polished attorney at his elbow, a man in an immaculate suit paid for by a wealthy uncle who preferred problems handled quietly. Their case was simple and sharp-edged. Lena was emotionally volatile, juggling shifts and bills. Daniel was a convicted felon who had a history of endangering lives. How, they argued, could a child be safe in a home built on that foundation? Every time the word conviction was spoken, Daniel's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. He kept his eyes forward as Lena's legal aid attorney laid out photos of bruises, emergency room notes, and timestamps from desperate messages, evidence of nights when Ryan's temper had left more than broken glasses behind. Ryan's lawyer responded with practiced ease. Those bruises were accidents, the messages taken out of context, the ER visits overreactions from a stressed young mother. The battle played out in language and paper, but what hung in the room was heavier, a judge's old mistake colliding with a family's new plea for protection. As Mason listened, he felt every argument against Lena brushing up against his own past words from years ago, the ones that had kept Daniel from hugging his daughter at night. The easy path was still there: treat Daniel as nothing more than an ex-con, let the old file speak louder than the new evidence. But each time he glanced at the man at the plaintiff's table, sitting silent and straight-backed beside his daughter, the echo of that first question rang louder in his own mind. Was he about to fail this family twice? The turning point came when it seemed there was nothing left to say. Lena's attorney glanced at the stack of photos and reports already submitted, then looked up at the bench. "Your Honor," she said, steadying her voice, "the plaintiff requests permission to call one additional witness, Mr. Daniel Ruiz." Every head in the room turned. Daniel rose slowly, leaning on his cane, and made his way to the stand with the careful steps of a man who had learned to move through hostile spaces without making sudden movements. Ryan's attorney leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk tugging at his mouth, already tasting the chance to parade Daniel's record in front of everyone. But when Daniel stated his full name for the court reporter, he didn't stop there. He added, "Former defendant in case number 14-327B, Ruiz versus Northline Development." The sequence of numbers hit Mason like a slap. That old file, long since moved to archives, was now being spoken into the record of a brand new case. Lena's lawyer approached the bench with a thin folder, a city oversight report, copies of whistleblower statements, letters quietly filed years after the collapse. They showed what Daniel had always known, that the developer admitted to falsifying safety records, that corners had been cut not by a foreman, but by executives who never set foot on scaffolding. As Mason read, his jaw tightened, the conflict he'd kept buried finally visible in the flicker of his eyes. On the stand, Daniel did not point a finger at him. He spoke instead about what that verdict had done, the lost years, the jobs that never called back, the way his daughter had learned to see courthouses as places where truth went to die. Then he looked at Mateo, small feet barely touching the floor, and said quietly that he was not asking this court to fix his past. He was asking it to protect his grandson's future. The silence that followed felt different from earlier ones, heavier, but cleaner somehow, as if something rotten had finally been named. Mason cleared his throat and, in measured words, acknowledged the oversight findings into the record, noting that they cast serious doubt on the original conclusions of the collapse case. He did not say "I was wrong," but everyone in that room heard it between the lines. Across the aisle, Ryan's attorney shifted uncomfortably. The power he'd relied on slipping as the story of who Daniel was, and who he wasn't, rewrote itself in front of the whole room. When Judge Mason finally lifted his eyes from the file, the room seemed to draw closer. He took a breath, the kind that gathers more than air, and began to speak in the measured tone of a man who knows every word will be remembered. The court, he said, had reviewed the evidence, the medical reports, the messages, and the testimony. It had also considered, very carefully, the history invoked in this room, not as a weapon, but as context. Then, in clear language, he granted Lena primary custody of Mateo. Ryan would have visitation, but only under supervision, and only if he complied with counseling and kept a clean record. There was a murmur from the gallery, the sound of tension slipping a notch. Mason wasn't finished. He leaned slightly forward, eyes settling briefly on Daniel as he stated for the record that the previous conviction tied to the Northline building collapse would not be used to question Lena's fitness as a mother. Subsequent findings, he said, had cast serious doubt on the foundations of that case. It was as close as he could come, in that role, to saying he had been wrong. Then, choosing his words like stepping stones, he added that the justice system could fail people more than once, and that this court would not let a past failure dictate a child's future. For the first time, he looked directly at Daniel, and something in his gaze softened. The gavel came down, but it sounded less like punishment and more like a door closing on an old room. In the hallway, reporters waited with microphones and hungry eyes, sensing a story about an old case, a humbled judge, a family who had pushed back. Daniel shielded Mateo with his body and gently steered Lena past them. "No, thank you," he said to the questions, his focus fixed on the two people beside him. Weeks later, the scene had shifted from oak benches to a small neighborhood park. Daniel sat on a worn green bench, cane resting against his knee, while Mateo shrieked with laughter on the playground, trying to conquer the climbing frame. Lena stood nearby, chatting with other parents, a coffee cup in her hand and a relaxed curve in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. Official letters still came, school notices, court follow-ups, clinic forms, but now she opened them without flinching. In the evenings, once a week, she hosted a small group in her living room, women who were learning to leave behind doors they used to think they were locked inside. They drank tea, shared stories of slammed cabinets and broken promises, and began, slowly, to believe they deserved more. Somewhere across town, in a quiet office lit by a desk lamp, Judge Mason sat alone with a stack of old files, names and case numbers tied to that same developer. He circled them for review, making notes, pushing for a process that might reopen more than one past wound. No cameras watched him there, no one applauded. It was just one man, late in his career, trying to drag a little more truth into the record before his time with the gavel ran out. And maybe that's the part we don't talk about enough, the way justice sometimes arrives late and limping, in the shape of an older man who still shows up for his daughter, or a judge who finally lets the weight of his choices change the way he rules. Sitting on that bench, watching Mateo run, Daniel didn't think of himself as a symbol. He just knew that he had stepped out of the back row and into the light when it mattered. And if you've ever felt like your past mistakes or someone else's judgment have written your whole story, maybe that's the quiet truth buried inside this one. You don't have to stay in the place they left you. Sometimes, standing up again, no matter how slowly, is the first verdict that really changes anything.